7 spiritual tests. Only the strongest souls face. Carl Jung. Carl Jung observed that the soul does not ask your permission before it changes the terms of your life. It simply changes them and calls the changing a crisis. As Jung wrote toward the end of his memoirs, the sole purpose of human existence is to kindle a light in the darkness of mere being, and he did not mean this as comfort. He meant it as a description of labor, of a task laid on certain souls at a certain hour, a task that looks at first like collapse, like failure, like the floor dropping out from under a life that had seemed, until that morning, entirely secure. And what I want to walk through with you tonight are not 7 tricks for a better life. They are the tests Jung actually watched his patients face, the tests he faced himself, the tests that do not care how strong you think you are until the day they arrive. If these evenings by the fire are useful to you, consider staying close by subscribing, so that tomorrow's teaching finds you the way this one did. The first key is the test of the unlived life returning, and here is what almost no one expects about it. It does not arrive as temptation, it arrives as demand. Jung called individuation a coming to selfhood, from CW7, and he meant something very specific, not becoming a better version of the person you already perform, but becoming the person you actually are underneath the performance. And the trouble is that the first half of life is spent building the performance. You choose a career because it was sensible. You choose a partner because the timing was right. You adopt opinions because your family or your class or your era required them. And none of this is dishonest. It is simply incomplete, because somewhere in the choosing, you set down capacities you did not have room for, the art you did not pursue, the solitude you never allowed yourself, the tenderness you decided was impractical. And Jung watched again and again as these unlived capacities did not disappear. They waited, filed away in some back room of the psyche, the way a house accumulates a room nobody opens, still furnished, still waiting, gathering a particular kind of dust. And imagine a woman who once wanted to paint, who set it aside at 22 because there were bills and a household, and no time for anything so impractical. And for 30 years, the wanting seemed to vanish entirely, until one ordinary Sunday, she finds herself standing in an art supply store for no reason she can name, buying brushes she has no plan to use. And this is not nostalgia, Jung would say. This is the unlived life finally demanding its hearing, and it rarely knocks politely. It knocks as restlessness, as a strange grief with no object, as envy of someone else's ordinary freedom, and at a certain hour, often without warning, it knocks loudest of all. This week, ask yourself plainly what you decided at 25 was impractical, and whether it has been standing at that locked door ever since, waiting for you specifically. So let me leave you with this quiet resolution. I will not mistake the knocking for a disturbance. I will not mistake the knocking for a disturbance. The second key is the test of the ground giving way. And this is not a metaphor Jung used lightly, because he lived it. At 38, after the break with Freud, Jung recalled in his memoirs a period in which he felt he had lost his footing entirely. The professional identity that had carried him, the theoretical certainty that had structured his days, all of it seemed suddenly insufficient. And he did not treat this as a breakdown to be medicated away. He treated it as a summons. He began recording his inner images, following the figures that rose up in his imagination. And what strikes me every time I return to this period of his life is how ordinary the crisis looked from the outside. He still saw patients, he still wrote letters, he still walked the shore of the lake near his house, and yet something underneath had gone unstable, the way ice looks solid from above, while shifting silently beneath. And here is the correction the culture rarely offers. This ground giving way is not what people later called a midlife crisis. That phrase belongs to Elliot J. Case, writing in 1965, and the idea that life begins at 40 belongs to a self-help writer named Walter Pitkin. Jung's concern was older and less tidy than either. He was not selling a second youth. He was describing a genuine reordering of the psyche. And notice how differently this reordering feels from the inside than the word crisis suggests. A crisis implies an event with edges, a beginning and an end, something you survive and then set behind you. But what Jung described was slower than that, more like a tide going out so gradually that you only notice the shoreline has changed when you look back at where the water used to reach. And this is precisely why so many people miss the moment it begins, because they are waiting for a single dramatic morning, a diagnosis, a collapse loud enough to explain itself, when the actual movement is closer to a slow subsidence, a foundation settling by fractions of an inch a year, until one day a door that always closed easily no longer quite fits its frame. Imagine a man who runs the hardware store his father built, who knows every shelf by instinct, who has spent 20 years being the fixed point his customers and his family both quietly rely on. And one autumn he notices, without any single cause he can name, that opening the shop each morning feels like lifting something far heavier than a metal shutter. The ledgers still balance. The regulars still nod at him the same way. Nothing on paper has failed. And yet the ground under this whole familiar arrangement no longer feels like ground. It feels like a floor he is standing on out of habit rather than conviction. And he may spend months calling this tiredness, or age, or the weather, before he ever calls it what Jung would have called it, a psyche, quietly withdrawing its consent from a structure it once fully believed in. And this withdrawal is not betrayal, and it is not weakness. It is closer to a tide obeying a pull no one in the harbor can see. This week, notice where the floor of your own life has begun to feel thinner than it did a year ago. Not because anything collapsed, but because something underneath has simply stopped agreeing to hold the old weight. So let me leave you with this quiet resolution. I will trust the ground shifting, rather than rush to rebuild it exactly as it was. I will trust the ground shifting, rather than rush to rebuild it exactly as it was. The third key is the test of the morning program's expiration. And Jung stated this with a precision that still startles me. He wrote that we cannot live the afternoon of life according to the program of life's morning. For what was great in the morning will be little at evening, and what in the morning was true will at evening have become a lie. From CW8. And notice what he is not saying. He is not saying your younger self was wrong. He is saying your younger self was solving a different problem. The morning program exists to build a container, an ego strong enough to meet the world, a career, a family, a reputation. And this is not vanity. It is necessary architecture, the way scaffolding is necessary before a wall can stand on its own. But architecture built for one season of the sun does not automatically suit the next, and scaffolding left standing after the wall is finished stops being support and starts being obstruction. And the test is this: will you notice when the program has quietly expired, or will you keep executing it out of loyalty to who you used to be? Imagine a man who built his entire sense of worth on being the reliable one, the one who never says no, the one whose calendar is a monument to usefulness. And at 55, the same behavior that once earned him respect now earns him only exhaustion. Nothing external has changed, the same requests, the same praise, and yet the fuel has gone out of it. And imagine too a woman who spent 2 decades perfecting the role of the one who holds everyone together, the household's quiet engineer, the friend who remembers every birthday, and one ordinary evening she notices she cannot remember the last time anyone asked what she needed. And rather than anger, what rises in her is a strange fatigue, as though she has been speaking a language for years that no longer has any listeners. And consider a third figure, a father who spent 15 years enforcing bedtime and homework and the small daily rules that keep a household of young children afloat, and who wakes one day to find those children nearly grown, no longer needing the rule so much as the relationship, and yet he keeps issuing the old instructions anyway, keeps checking the same boxes, because the checking itself became who he thought he was, and the children, sensing the mismatch before he does, begin to pull away not from him, but from the outdated program he keeps running in his place. This is not depression arriving from nowhere. In Jung's language, it is closer to a message the psyche informing the ego that the morning's currency no longer buys what the afternoon requires, the way a coin minted for one country goes quietly worthless the moment you cross the border into another, or the way a wardrobe suited perfectly to one climate hangs uselessly heavy in another, still fine cloth, still well made, simply wrong for the weather you are now standing in. And this is worth restating plainly, because the mind resists it. The expiration is not a punishment for having lived the first half wrong. It is proof that you lived it well enough to complete it. Only the completed program can expire. An unfinished one simply drags on unresolved, and there is a strange grief hidden inside this news, because retiring the program can feel like betraying the very discipline that built your life, as though gratitude for what worked and permission to let it end were somehow opposites. They are not, Jung added, in that same passage, that this new demand carries a significance of its own, meaning the afternoon is not a decline from the morning, it is a different mountain with a different view, and the climber who keeps using the morning's map on the afternoon's mountain will only grow more exhausted with every step that should have been growing lighter. Notice too how quietly this test arrives, not as a single dramatic refusal, but as a slow accumulation of small frictions. The effort it now takes to perform a role that once came without thinking, the private irritation you cannot quite explain when praised for the very habit that has begun to feel like a costume. So here is the resolution I ask you to hold quietly this week. I will retire the program that has already. The fourth key is the test of achievement without meaning, and this is the one that confuses people most, because it does not announce itself through failure, it announces itself through success that has stopped tasting like anything. Jung described patients, often in the second half of life, who had accumulated every outward marker of a life well built: position, income, a settled household, a name that opened doors, and who arrived in his consulting room describing something closer to a slow suffocation than a crisis. Nothing to point to, no betrayal, no diagnosis, no single wound you could name and dress, only a flatness that sat underneath every accomplishment, like static under a clear signal. And what makes this test so disorienting is that it violates the one rule the ego has always trusted, the rule that says, if you work hard enough, and climb high enough, and gather enough proof of your own worth, the ache will finally stop. And here is a man who did exactly that, and the ache did not stop, it simply changed its clothing. Imagine a businessman, and this is very near the case Jung had in mind when he wrote about the second half of life. A man who spent 30 years expanding a company from nothing, who measured every year by growth, who could recite, almost like scripture, the exact size of the operation in its first decade against its size now, and who upon finally reaching the summit of his own ambition found not triumph waiting there, but a strange, disorienting silence, as though the mountain had been climbed and there was nothing at the top to greet him, no committee, no medal, only weather, and the wind moving through an empty room. And this is the test, because the ego assumes that more of the same medicine will cure the flatness, more success, more recognition, another summit purchased at the same cost as the last one. And Jung watched this strategy fail every time it was tried, not because success is worthless, but because the flatness was never a shortage of achievement in the first place. It was a message, and the message was that achievement had become the entire diet, that every other hunger in the man had been quietly starved so that this one hunger could be fed without interruption, and the soul, starved of anything else, was refusing to be nourished any further by the same meal, no matter how large the portion. Think of it the way you would think of a body fed nothing but one nutrient for 30 years. At first it seems to thrive, the numbers on the chart look excellent, and then slowly, without any single dramatic collapse, something essential goes missing, that no increase in that one nutrient can restore. This is not weakness in the man. Jung was careful never to read it as weakness. It is the psyche's own accounting, presenting its bill after decades of being told to wait. Imagine, closer to home, someone who has spent years chasing a promotion, certain that the title itself would settle something restless underneath, and the promotion arrives, and for a week it glows, and then it sits on the shelf beside the last one, and the restlessness underneath has not moved an inch. This is not because the promotion was the wrong promotion. It is because the promotion was never the right kind of answer to the question being asked. The question was never really about rank. Ask yourself this week whether the thing you are chasing harder is the very thing that has already stopped satisfying you. Notice it plainly, without judgment, the way you would notice that a meal you once loved no longer has any flavor, and ask what you have been avoiding by keeping your attention so completely occupied with the chase. Because the chasing itself, Jung suggested, often becomes a way of avoiding the deeper question underneath it. A very effective way, since a life spent climbing rarely leaves a person time to ask why they are climbing, or toward what. So let this resolution settle quietly. I will stop feeding the hunger, the food that no longer feeds it. I will stop feeding the hunger, the food that no longer feeds it. The fifth key is the test that turns. And I want to be honest with you now, rather than later. Everything I have described so far has been easy to nod along to as long as it stayed at a comfortable distance. The collapsed patient, the exhausted man, the hollow businessman. And there is a particular comfort in watching someone else's crisis from the outside, the way you might watch weather move across a valley that is not your own. You can admire the shape of the storm. You can even feel a little moved by it, and still go home dry. But Jung was not interested in case studies as entertainment. He used them because they were mirrors, and a mirror that is never lifted to your own face has done you no good at all. So let me turn this one toward you directly, not toward some composite figure in a consulting room decades ago, but toward this week, toward your actual calendar, toward the version of you that answered 3 messages before finishing this very sentence. What is the morning program you are still executing out of loyalty rather than truth? What is the unlived capacity knocking at your particular locked door? What is the achievement you keep polishing because you cannot yet admit it has gone flat? Jung taught that individuation cannot be borrowed. It cannot be observed second-hand and absorbed by proximity. You can watch 100 businessmen collapse under the weight of empty success and remain entirely untouched if you do not turn the same question on your own days. Imagine, for a moment, someone listening to this very teaching the way you might listen to a weather report from another country, nodding, agreeing in principle, and then closing the window and returning to exactly the same arrangement of the furniture in their life. This is the most ordinary form the avoidance takes, not denial exactly, but a kind of polite distance, a willingness to understand the idea completely while keeping it at arm's length from the actual hours of Tuesday and Wednesday. And Jung watched this happen constantly in his consulting room. Patients who could describe their own patterns with remarkable insight, who could diagnose their persona, name their complex, trace their projection with real precision, and who still returned the following week, having changed nothing, because insight that stays in the head has not yet reached the life. Imagine a woman who reads a passage exactly like this one, who feels something stir, a recognition, almost a relief at being seen, and who then closes the page and drives to the same job, rehearses the same explanations to herself, keeps the same appointment with the same fatigue. Not because she is dishonest, but because turning the mirror all the way around so that it faces her rather than the idea of her is a different and much harder motion than simply agreeing with a teaching. And here is the uncomfortable part. The reason this turn feels so exposing is that the ego has a vested interest in keeping these tests at a distance, as someone else's story. Because as long as they belong to someone else, nothing in your schedule has to change. Nothing in your relationships has to be renegotiated. Nothing in your sense of who you are has to be questioned before dinner. But the moment you ask, quietly, without performance, without an audience even in your own mind, what in my own life is expiring right now, the test stops being a lecture and becomes a mirror, and the mirror does not flatter. Jung was clear that this recognition is not comfortable. It is not meant to be. Coming to selfhood, in his own phrase, is a demanding process, not a soothing one. It asks you to admit that the person you built so carefully across 20 or 30 years, the one who learned exactly how to be useful, how to be liked, how to be capable, may not be the whole of who you are, and that admission, however quiet, however privately made, is where the actual work begins, not in the noticing, which is easy, but in the staying with what is noticed, long enough for it to change something. This week, take one evening, sit with paper, and write down honestly which of the earlier tests is already underway in your own life, not hypothetically, not as an interesting idea to entertain, but actually, specifically, by name, the ground shifting under a particular decision, the program still running past its season, the achievement that has gone quiet in your mouth, and once it is named, resist the urge to immediately solve it. Jung was not asking his patients to fix the recognition, only to hold it, to let it be true for a while before deciding what to do about it, because the turning itself, the willingness to let the question land on you rather than on someone else, is already the beginning of the work. So hold this resolution and let it be yours alone tonight. I will stop watching the test from a distance and let it find me. I will stop watching the test from a distance and let it find me. The sixth key is the test of becoming undivided, and this is where all 5 earlier tests are quietly heading, whether you noticed it or not, because Jung chose his word for this process with great care, individuation, from the Latin individuus, meaning that which cannot be divided. And he meant this almost literally. Most of us live divided. One version of ourselves at work, another at home, another still in the privacy of our own unspoken thoughts, a persona negotiated with the world, an unlived life, stored somewhere unreachable, an achievement pursued long after it stopped nourishing anything. And each of the tests we have walked through tonight is really the same test wearing different clothing, the psyche pressing toward wholeness, insisting that these divided fragments be gathered rather than perpetually managed. This is not the same as becoming perfect. Jung was careful and almost stubborn about this distinction. Individuation does not produce a flawless person, it produces a complete one, someone who has stopped exiling half of what they are in exchange for the approval of the other half. And I want you to notice how much daily labor goes into keeping the fragments apart, because division is not a single event, it is a maintenance project. You wake and assemble the version of yourself fit for the commute. You arrive and assemble the version fit for the meeting. You return home and assemble yet another version fit for the people who love you. And by the time the house is quiet, you are too tired to assemble the version that is simply, privately, you. And this exhaustion is not laziness. It is the cost of running several households under one roof. Imagine, quite plainly, a woman who spends her Tuesday exactly this way, sharp and composed in a morning meeting, gentle and endlessly patient with a child by evening, and then alone at 11 at night, scrolling through her phone, feeling a loneliness she cannot explain to either version of herself. And here is what Jung would have asked her, not which version is the real one, but why she has never let them sit in the same room. Because the question individuation poses is not which of yourselves should win, it is whether the selves can finally stop being negotiated as rivals and start being received as one person under many weathers. Think, too, of a man who spends his working hours as the calm and capable one, the person colleagues bring their panic to because he never seems to catch it himself, and who then drives home each evening rehearsing, without quite admitting it, the small performance of having everything settled, and one Sunday afternoon, doing nothing in particular, raking leaves perhaps, or standing at a sink washing a single cup. He feels something rise in his chest that he has no name for. Not sadness exactly, something closer to the ache of a held breath finally released. And this is not a crisis arriving. This is the undivided self attempting, for one unguarded moment, to be present all at once, calm and unsettled and tired and hopeful in the same body, without needing to file any of it under a separate room. And most of us, catching this feeling, immediately reach for a task to smother it. Because wholeness, when it first arrives, does not feel like relief. It feels like exposure, like standing in a room with all the lights on, after years of moving carefully between shadows. Jung wrote of this wholeness not as an achievement you arrive at once and keep forever, but as a direction you keep turning toward, a compass rather than a destination. And this matters because it removes the pressure of ever being finished. You are not failing individuation if you still catch yourself dividing on a Tuesday. You are simply mid-journey, the same way a river is not failing to be a river when it bends. The gathering Jung described happens slowly, in small, honest moments, the meeting where you say the true thing instead of the expected thing, the evening where you let the tired version and the composed version be witnessed by the same person without apology, the small refusal to perform competence when what you actually feel is uncertainty, the small refusal to perform cheerfulness when what you actually feel is grief. And none of these moments look dramatic from the outside. No one applauds them. No one even notices most of them. And that is precisely their value. Because wholeness is rarely built in the grand gesture. It is built in the 1,000 unglamorous instances where you choose not to split yourself in two for the sake of someone else's comfort. And slowly, through many such moments repeated over years rather than days, something that was scattered begins to function as a whole. Not a flawless whole, never that, but a coherent one. A person who no longer needs 3 separate names for 3 separate rooms of the same house. A person who can be tired in front of the child, and capable in front of the colleague, and uncertain in front of themselves, without treating any one of these as a betrayal of the others. This is what Jung meant by coming to selfhood. Not a rival, but the slow, ordinary, unfinished work of letting your many rooms open onto one hallway. So let this final resolution settle into you tonight. I will gather what I have divided and call it whole. I will gather what I have divided and call it whole. Here is the whole picture. The unlived life knocks and asks to be let in. The ground gives way and asks to be trusted rather than fought. The morning program expires and asks to be retired with gratitude. Achievement goes flat and asks to be fed something other than more of itself. The test turns toward you and asks to be recognized as yours and not another's. And the fragments gathered together ask only to be called whole. None of this arrives to punish you. It arrives the way autumn arrives, not as the enemy of summer, but as the season summer was always quietly preparing you for. So wherever you are tonight, in whichever of these tests you now recognize your own week, your own calendar, your own quiet exhaustion, know that Jung did not write of this as a curse laid on the strong. He wrote of it as the ordinary demand of a life still becoming itself. And that demand, however heavy it feels in the middle of it, is the very shape of the light you were always meant to kindle. And so the tests you have faced, and the tests still waiting for you, are not 7 trials to survive. They are one long invitation to become undivided, which is only ever the invitation to become, at last, yourself.